Welcome, everybody. We are here tonight at the Zoning Recodification Public Forum. This is the second forum we're holding. My name is Jennifer Raid. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town. I'm going to just quickly walk through what we're planning to do tonight. There is not an agenda on the table. The agenda is over here, and I'm just going to quickly outline what we're going to do tonight. So first, some welcome and introductions to what the meeting is all about. Then we're going to give you some time. I'm going to walk through some of the documents that we've handed out, and also you're going to have time to review the documents. The majority of tonight's meeting is really for you to ask us some questions. And if we have some answers, we'll provide some answers, but it's a way for us to get some information as we move forward through this process of recodification. Then we'll talk about the next steps in the process, which includes the whole timeline for when we're trying to complete the recodification, and hopefully we'll adjourn at 9 p.m. So anybody have any questions? Anybody in the wrong room? Pete, you're in the wrong room. Is there anything I can do? Is it better like this? Okay, sorry about that. Let me put it really close to my mouth. It sounds really loud to me when I hold this microphone to my mouth like this. So first, round of introductions. So up in the front row, we have members of the Zoning Recodification Working Group. This is basically the project team. The core team is the working group. And so maybe you could all stand if you're with the Zoning Recodification Working Group. I think Mike as well. So we have Mike Byrne, Rick Valarelli, they're with Inspectional Services. Christian Klein is with the ZBA. You can wave if you want to. David Watson is representing the Arlington Redevelopment Board. Steve Revelek is a town meeting member. David Watson is also a town meeting member. Charlie Kalauskis is with the Master Plan Implementation Committee. Kathy Garnett is Charlie, and that's Judy Barrett. She is the consultant with RKG Associates and now a Barrett Planning Group. Kathy Garnett is representing the Conservation Commission. Then we have Laura, who is with the Planning Office. She's the Assistant Director. And we have Nancy Flynn Barvik, who is a town manager appointee, and also Adam Chapdelaine sits on the committee as well, and myself. So that's the team. Other people who are not here tonight include Ralph Wilmer, who's also with the Master Plan Implementation Committee. So thanks, everybody. We're going to come back to them because they're going to help answer some questions along the way a little bit later. So the Zoning Recodification Working Group, some of you may recall, we have 4 working groups that bridged from the Master Plan Implementation Committee. So there's also the Residential Study Group, there's a Historic and Cultural Resources Group, there's a Millbrook Study Group, and each one of them has a suite of things that they're working on. So recodification was just one of those efforts in order to implement the master plan, which, as many of you know, was adopted in 2015. And one of the very first parts to the master plan implementation effort was to address issues with our zoning bylaw. So town staff are obviously included in ushering forward this effort, but ultimately the Arlington Redevelopment Board is the town body with the jurisdiction and the authority to put forward many amendments for the zoning bylaw, as well as other groups. Many citizens come together and often put together petitions. But in this particular process, this will go through the Arlington Redevelopment Board, and there will be hearings, et cetera. I should just note there are other members of the consultant team who cannot be here this evening, including Eric Halverson, Bob Mitchell, and Bob Ritchie. So for those of you who might be a little bit new to the process, I know many of the faces in the room who are certainly know many details about this process, but the recodification effort has 4 components to it that we'll be repeating a lot tonight. And the goal is really, the primary goal has always been to make it a more navigable, a goal is to make the document easy to navigate. So we want people to be able to open up the document, to know where to go to look for things. So there's some color coding, there's some easy to use references along the way. basically something that any user, not just somebody who has experience reading zoning bylaws, anybody can open up and understand. We wanted to also simplify and update the language in the zoning bylaw to make it more modern and up to date whenever possible. We want a structure that makes sense. And then the last thing, and really a very important component, is both internal and external consistency with both internal policies, internal rules or other laws, and external in terms of state law, case law, and the Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act. So those are the goals of the recodification effort. I think I've now outlined this at this point, but the goals overall are really to implement something that is one of the very first items. It is actually number one as a land use goal recommendation in the master plan. We know that the current bylaw, for those of us, for anybody here who's tried to navigate the current document, it's very difficult to understand. There are many items within the zoning bylaw that sometimes contradict one another. It's challenging to navigate for that reason. And then there's some components of it that lack consistency and are not up to date with other practices that happen. So for example, we have an Arlington conservation bylaw that is much more up to date than the zoning bylaw. And then it sets a framework for us to do other zoning work in the future. The master plan is the vision for the town's land use goals, housing goals, economic development goals, transportation, et cetera. And within that document, we outline many other possible zoning updates that many people are looking forward to seeing happen. But we want to do that on top of a baseline that, a baseline document that makes sense to lots of people. And so that's the idea behind having a framework for the zoning so it can be modified for the future. So this is an updated project timeline. The last public meeting that we held was in July. Many of you were there. Some of you there's some new faces in the room. We've updated this so that for one, we added more time to the process. You're still looking at the relatively same document as you were looking at back in July, the second reading draft. So in this timeline, you can see we hired RKG last fall, 2016. The Zoning Recodification Working Group has been working with RKG since that time. In the winter months, we did a number of things. We had interviews with a number of key stakeholders. We had an all-board meeting. RKG provided a document to us which updated a zoning audit, basically looking piece by piece at the zoning bylaw to figure out what needed to change. These were recommendations and things that we could think about in order to modernize the zoning. So they updated that document. We were given a first reading draft. There's 3 reading drafts in this entire process. We were given a first reading draft. We then gave some feedback to RKG from the Zoning Recodification Working Group, and that led to the summer process, which included a July public meeting, and lots more feedback that we've received by email, in writing, at various meetings along the way, and has led to this second public forum. We've also been holding some open houses here in the Planning and Community Development Office. There's still a few of those left, so that's an opportunity essentially for people to come in and ask any questions that they have about either the recodification process, the zoning bylaw, et cetera. Whatever, one-on-one, an opportunity to ask their questions. We anticipate that we will have a third reading draft by into November, so that we will be able to hold a public hearing, which would be the next step in the process. We'll have a third reading draft. That's actually the hearing draft. And that would be going to the Arlington Redevelopment Board in December. We then anticipate having another public forum before the special town meeting. We can't predict exactly when the special town meeting will be because the Board of Selectmen calls the special town meeting, but we anticipate that it will be in the winter of 2018. So hopefully late January, perhaps early February. And that is in a nutshell the project timeline. And if all goes well, the zoning bylaw would be adopted at that special town meeting. And then typically what happens is we have about 90 days, sometimes longer than that, for the Attorney General's office to approve the zoning bylaw. It comes back to us, and then we will have a new zoning bylaw. So that was the timeline. So now I want to walk through with you just a number of documents. There's a lot of paper in your hand. Some of you may have already come here prepared. We posted these documents online about a week ago. I know there's a lot of information to digest in there. So what I'm going to do is just quickly walk through the documents and then give all of you an opportunity to sit back with those documents for about 15 minutes of your time to sit, read the documents. Maybe you can talk to somebody else about them if you'd like. And then we will open it up for questions. All right, so we've got a zoning assessment, which I mentioned to you. That is the document that says RKG, zoning assessment, right on it. Essentially what this was, as I said, in the master plan, in one of the appendices, is a zoning audit. It was a memo that was written to Carol Kowalski, the previous Director of Planning and Community Development, and Laura Weiner, and it provided a fairly detailed audit of our zoning bylaw. As I said, we asked RKG to go back to that assessment and update it again. And so that is what this document is. But it includes something more. There's in the added language, basically the last sentence, which is in the color red, is a response to whether or not something has been changed. So this is their zoning comments, general comments, et cetera. It goes section by section. And then the last sentence is telling you what has changed or what has not changed and where you can find it in any of the documents. This document says RKG, and it says on the top, zoning assessment. And if for those of you, does anybody not have this document? Okay. So that's the zoning assessment. Many of the changes will be incorporated into the next draft, I might note. As I said, we've received lots of comments. You're not looking at a new updated zoning bylaw yet, but we are still in the process of responding to comments. All right, that was the zoning assessment. Now there's two more documents that both say Guide to the Arlington Zoning Bylaw Recodification. The first one looks like this. And it has a cover sheet with an introduction to it that explains the document. And inside that document is a section-by-section review, and it's meant to be reviewed by row, and then under each column is showing you a comparison between the existing zoning bylaw, the existing zoning bylaw section, the proposed zoning bylaw section, so that you can know where to find where something went to, and a summary of that amendment, and then the amendment purpose. And the purpose being one of those items that I mentioned earlier as the goals of the recodification process. Did we do it for greater usability, readability, unifying certain sections, internal or external consistency, etc. So that's what this document is. The next document is a guide. It says Guide to the Arlington Zoning Bylaw Definitions. There were so many definitions. This was a wonderful document prepared, I might add, by Christian Klein and Ralph Wilmer. The entire zoning recodification working group prepared these documents, section by section. And so when we get to your questions, members of the group will be able to answer based upon what they've worked on, and or will provide additional backup from Judy or myself or others. So on the definitions document, this one has an existing term, which is a definition that you can see in the current bylaw. Then it has existing zoning bylaw definition, the proposed what it says in the second reading draft, which everybody has a copy of, or if you don't, there's another copy back on the table back there. And then the proposed bylaw definition, and then if there were any notes about that, some notes in a fourth column. Yes? The proposed, so this is after the town received the second reading draft, we were providing our additional amendments and edits back to RKG, which included many comments from people in this room and others who emailed us. And so we merged all of that into what we would propose to be the language in that definition. So it hasn't changed yet, but we would like to see it change for the third reading draft. Right. You're welcome. I think I covered everything on that. So I just want to walk through, and then I'm going to give us some time, to look at all this in greater detail. This is just some examples of what I'm talking about in terms of what something changed, what does it mean. So, for example, and this was randomly selected. There's no meaning. Didn't choose this for any particular reason. 3.02 is an existing section of the zoning bylaw, and the title of that section is Description of Zoning Districts. The new proposed zoning bylaw section is 5.4.1, and then there's a summary of what changed. Section 3.02 in this particular case provides a brief description of each district along with the purpose for which that district was intended. The recodified zoning bylaw presents this material in three sections corresponding to residential districts, business districts, and other districts. Descriptions of residential districts then appear in section 5.4.1 of the recodified bylaw. The purpose of this amendment? Greater usability. So that was an example of something where we tried to make the document more usable. Another example noted here is the table of off-street parking regulations was also rewritten to be more clear and with similar uses grouped together. Okay, another example. This is an example where we're trying to be consistent with state laws. Permit time limits. Currently in section 10.07, the definition is defined by the building code. Current zoning bylaw doesn't outline it exactly that way. So the amendment summary is to propose to actually have it be the correct definition in the building code, like as in the state building code. Another example of consistency with a state law, and this was spotlighted in the zoning audit and assessment. We currently require a special permit for uses such as churches, daycares, public and private schools, etc. Proposed zoning bylaw proposes to remove all those uses from the use table because they're allowed by right and as required by state law. Another item which I mentioned earlier as an example was the Arlington Conservation Commission has an Arlington Conservation Bylaw, which is actually more stringent. So what we did was we are proposing some internal consistency to remove certain sections of the bylaw that are already noted by the Conservation Commission as being available in their current regulations. And this was something that the Conservation Commission has already discussed. Lastly, just as another example for you to understand more about the usability that we're looking for in this new zoning bylaw, the table of use regulations has had a lot of work done to it. And use regulations for the 6 business districts, currently it's in 5.04. The proposed zoning bylaw is 5.5.3. And you can see, again, the uses are grouped into similar categories or similar types of land uses so that it's easier to search and navigate for what you're trying to do with your property. All right, so before we get to that, I am going to give you all time, 15 minutes, to review the documents, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So I think for now, you just take a pause, and if you don't want to hang out here, that's okay. We're going to pause, and you're going to sit and hang out and read the documents, then we'll come back and answer questions. Okay, thank you. We're going to come back together. We are at 1:15, and I've given us about an hour for Q&A. This is not the end of the process, so if you have more comments and more questions, you can always send us an email. There's when we get to the end slide, you'll see the address that you can use, zoningrecod@town.arlington.ma.us. We're keeping the comments open until November 9th, and so this is not the end of the process. You're looking at a document that has not been completely updated since July. So you may have given us comments already that you don't see reflected in this draft. There's a reason for that. It hasn't been updated. There have been a couple of updates. The first one is that the town meeting changes, the amendments that were adopted, the spring town meeting, were approved by the Attorney General's office. So those updates have been incorporated. They were not in the last draft that you may have seen. And then there were some errors that we caught in the second reading draft that we addressed. We probably didn't get everything, and I understand that, but we still have time. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I want to say is that we're talking about policy, but we're not talking about substantial policy changes, which means that we have to comply with internal policies and rules and regulations, and then we have to also comply with state laws and rules and regulations. So that does sound like policy. That is the policy that we've always been talking about. The more substantial land use policy changes, that's what we want to do next. So for example, the residential study group has a number of things that they would like to address and work on in relation to residential issues. Those are more substantial policy issues that are not addressed through the recodification process. So with that, I've got some suggestions for how I'd like us to have some Q&A. So now it says come to the mic, assemble at the mic for questions. Andrew is the mic. He's the mic stand. Andrew Bunnell is also the chair of the Arlington Redevelopment Board, but playing a double role this evening. And we will ask you to please state your name, and if you have any affiliation you wish to share, please do so. And essentially any question you have on the table about recodification documents that you're looking at, maybe you saw in the past that you have a comment about the process, about the project team, about anything about recodification, we'll try to answer it tonight. That's the idea. A few rules one of them is assemble at the mic. The second one is please use some brevity and respect people's time here this evening. We do only have this hour. Doesn't mean that we want to get everybody's time and we want to address the questions, but we want to be conscious of time. And then if you have a feeling of you're feeling disagreeable, or you're feeling a concern about something, please express yourself with respect towards other people, towards the town, if possible, and towards each other. Please use respect in this room. So with that, I see that somebody has a question.
Is it on? It's on. Hi, I'm Paul Parisi. I live up on Precinct 15. I have a general process question, and it may be somewhat simple and naive, but I've followed the documents online. I've had a very difficult time trying to understand how the new documents have changed from the original document. I really would like to urge a red line copy be developed. I used to be a co-owner and principal of a consulting engineering business. We used to prepare very detailed studies, detailed equipment specifications, sometimes 200, 300 pages long. And during the process, we'd have lots of revisions. And even 10, 15 years ago, with Microsoft Word, we could do red line copies for our clients. And it may have gotten unwieldy at the time, and that 200-page document became 400 pages, but everyone could follow it. And at the end, we could resolve it, issue the clean copy, and it would become part of the contract of the job. It was a legal document in the end. I look at this as a legal document, but we're not able to follow it very clearly. I really wish the company you hire, whoever it is, would reconsider producing a true red line copy so I can look at the original zoning laws now and see exactly how you got to where you are today. It's not easy to do this. And unfortunately, I'm older and retired and more lazy, and I really don't want to try to reconstruct it myself. So that's my suggestion. I really would hope you consider that. And if anyone can explain to me why that document can't be produced, I would like to hear, and maybe the question I'm asking is not valid. There could be a good reason why you cannot produce that kind of document. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll answer this question. We are not planning to provide a red line document. There won't be a document like that. What we can do is continue to provide more detail about what the changes are, where things are moving to. We've already got a good start at that with the table, and we can go into greater detail with that document. I'm not going to provide an answer on behalf of the consulting firm. It is not in their contract to do that. And then I would just say that we have moved substantial portions of the zoning bylaw around, and to have a red line document would be a very long, more complicated read, frankly, than looking at a chart and table that's showing where things have moved to. The majority of the changes, if you look at the table, are for greater readability and usability. And so I hope that that will suffice. I recognize, however, that we may need to make more edits to make it even more readable to folks who want to follow along more carefully, like yourself and others probably. So thank you. Anybody want to add anything additional? All right. Mike?
Oh, thank you. John Worden, town meeting member. Yeah, I have a number of questions, and I would second, I know you, Mr. Parisi made a very good point. It's been point made by others, including, I think, me at previous meetings. It is the way that things are done these days. It's not even a new invention, according to him. And I don't know why you decline to do it, because it is the simplest way to show changes. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, people are going to think that you're hiding something. And maybe you are, I don't know. I have a number of questions. One is in the definitions, or no, not in the definitions, in the chart that supposedly tracks the changes. And I don't think we really care what's in the first reading draft, the second reading draft. What we want to know is what's in the original bylaw and what are you proposing to do? Mm-hmm. And you start with eviscerating the very nice recital of the purposes of zoning. And I had understood you were going to put that back. You know, not everybody has a copy of the 1975 session laws in their briefcase. And I think that the recital of those things, those provisions, those purposes, those goals is essential. And you shouldn't just try to say, well, you can look it up because everybody's got their statutes at hand. You're right.
So just to stop there for a moment, we are addressing that. That will be in the third reading draft, as in we're going to put it back to the way it is in the existing bylaw.
Okay, but that's not what your chart says.
The chart is telling you what is in the second reading draft. It's not telling you what we will change it to, because we're still accepting comments right now.
Well,
but thank you.
This is confusing. Now, another piece is you've taken out the part about, I can't think exactly, well, the part about undersized lots. And the law says it's in 48. It says that a lot of record of 5,000 feet can be built upon, and then it says unless it was under common ownership with the lot next door. Now, the reason that that language was added in 1985, of which I was the author, was that the building department was saying, okay, this guy's got two 5,000-foot lots. This one doesn't have a house on it. He can build a house on it, no question. They said, wait a minute, that doesn't comply with 48, so we specifically put that in there so that they would stop doing that.
Okay.
Now, the next question I have relates to the chart, and maybe again you're going to say this isn't up to date. In the R5 district, I can't see what I think this chart is very confusing, frankly.
You're in the second reading draft, so you're
should
in
I
the
ignore
actual
this?
draft.
I'm trying to see what this is. The residential apartment.
John, which page number or what section does it say? 5 dash.
Well, it's page number.
Or Andrew, can you read that?
Oh, 516.
To help me?
7, 516.
5-16.
5-16
Yeah.
is what we're looking at in the second reading draft, not in the table.
Yeah,
Okay.
Where is the height for apartment buildings? Is that?
Could I have this is the residential group. Could I have is it Charlie? John, can you repeat your question, please?
Where is the prescribed maximum height
height.
for apartment buildings?
So you have to look for the zone.
Down here? All right, that's okay.
There's another mic.
Now, again, in R 735,
Right.
where is R 7?
On page 5-16 is the R5 district, and it's at the very bottom, just above the notes. You have any residential, it's 35 feet, 3 stories. And an accessory is 20 feet, 2 stories. So it's at the bottom, it's at the end of the chart.
Any other?
Can you use the mic, please? If or wait, I'm not sure that John was done, but
No, but he'll
But-
let me. Is this on?
yes, it is.
That the most people looking at these charts for dimension
Yes.
are used to it's spread across. Yes, it does mean the chart has to turn horizontally, but to divide the chart up and make it vertical, I think a lot of people, this is where I think John's finding difficulty finding things, because it's quite unusual compared to other zoning bylaws and ordinances.
Anything further from the group? We've got the comment at this point.
All right. Well,
Yeah, there's-
I still don't see a maximum height for it. Where's apartment building in this R7?
Any residential or other principal structure would include apartment building. Principal building and structure is principal, yeah.
So essentially, it's still in there, but it's moved around in the table, and it looks different than the way that you are used to reading it. I understand. Is that the main difference? The way the table is organized, correct?
35 feet?
John, I'm going to need to move on to other people with questions, unless you have one more question.
A lot more than that, so maybe that's an improvement. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Robert Kalani. I go to Middlesex Community College in Bedford. I am currently here because of
Can you hold the
assignment.
mic a little bit closer to your mouth, please?
I am currently here for an assignment about an essay having to do with town meeting like things, for example this. But I have a couple questions. First one is in Article 5.04 in Section 4.08. You stated that it gave a list of various types of clubs. country, in quotes, was a type of club, and you asked the question, what does country mean? So I wanted to say that they were talking about country clubs. And regardless of this, it stated that you removed it as a type of club. It also went on to talk about private gainful businesses, and I wanted to understand if that was the reasoning for removing it, or if it was simply for the lack of understanding that they meant a country club when they meant the word country.
5.04 has the existing bylaw has country club in it.
It gave a list of various things.
It had a
said
list,
country,
and it's
tennis.
consolidated into a smaller group. That's what you're asking?
Yeah, I was asking because the country club's kind of a general type of club, so I was wondering if you removed it because it was considered a private gainful business, or you removed it because you weren't sure if they needed to expand the list more, I guess, then?
Why
Or-
was it changed? Country
Yeah.
club. Was it changed?
It's in the document with the RWF on the top right, or top left.
Actually, the document is over there now, so 5.0, what was the number?
Article 5.04, Section 4.08. It was in the table of the original bylaw.
Could any of you, or could Judy? Oh, okay. All right, so then who's the appropriate person to help out,
Over here, sorry.
please? Anybody? Yes, and so. Thank you. Oh, you're in the RKG memo. Okay. Sorry, we were looking in the wrong place. Okay, 5.04, country fishing. Country was removed from the category. What does country mean? This is from your memo, Judy. I'm sorry. Okay, so we got the question. We might have to come back to you. Okay? Is there another question? We'll be back with you in a second.
So after this revision, the recodification, whatever you called it, goes to the special town meeting, what happens after that if they vote yes?
The zoning bylaw, if it's adopted, which would require a 2/3 vote of the town meeting, the zoning bylaw is sent to the Attorney General's office, and
then what if he says no?
Usually they would come back and maybe provide comments or changes or edits that we might have to address, but if it's approved, then it's an approved new zoning bylaw.
And then when all this process is done after this, what are you guys going to be doing? Like what is, unless you guys just continuously update the bylaw, what is your next job?
So we're not at that stage yet. So we
that's fair. I was just wondering.
We have talked about a number of things that are possible that relate to the master plan, including looking at the business districts. We need further updates to the sign permit process and the sign bylaw. Those are things that would come next after this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your question. Chris and then Patricia.
Thank you, Chris Loretti. I'd like to make one substantive comment and then lead into a couple procedural comments. On the substantive comment, I'm looking at the second reading draft, page 512-12, and in particular the dimensional regulations relating to, first the R2 zone. I think you've got the front yard setback too big. And then on the rear yard setbacks for lots of, for lots between 100 and 200 foot depth, they're also too big. Or actually, I got that wrong. Yes, I said that right.
5-12. We'll look at that. We'll see if there's a problem with the way that it's
But
been.
it's clearly not consistent with the current bylaw, and unless you were intending to change it, then that needs to be fixed. I'd sent previously a lot of comments like that, and I don't want to send them again. I understand you're still revising it.
Could you hold the mic closer to you so that we
Yeah,
can
I said
read?
I
Thank
had
you.
sent these on the second reading draft, and I understand you haven't made all the changes, but that leads to my more general comments on the process. And I would really ask that as you update the drafts, you give them a new number. It's very confusing to have more than one second reading draft, even if it doesn't have a different date on it. It doesn't matter to me whether it's 2.1 or 3 or something else, but it makes it a lot easier to track if it's got a version number on it and not just dates. But I think I heard you said earlier that the next draft that's produced will be the draft that's used for the public hearing, and I have a real problem with that. The way that the zoning hearings go before the ARB, and I served on the ARB and I've been through these, is often the final version of the text to be changed doesn't come out until a week or so before the hearing, and that's not nearly enough time for people to review it. We don't have a complete draft with all of the changes to date made in it yet. Even if you don't do a red line version, we don't have that. And a week or two before the hearing is not going to be enough time. And it doesn't make sense to me to have another public forum after the hearing and after the ARB's already voted on whether they're going to support the new bylaw or not, because no changes can be made until it gets to town meeting. I think you really want to concentrate on getting it right before the ARB votes on it, and then nothing happens until it goes to town meeting. Just one final point on the way you're tracking the changes, excuse me. For my purposes, I don't care about the formatting changes. All I care about is the substance. And it seems to me you're spending an awful lot of effort tracking the formatting changes, which to me doesn't matter. And I would really ask you, if you really feel you need to do that in a table, divide the table into two, and in one section have only the substantive changes, and another have only the formatting changes. Because I think most of us who have concerns about the bylaw and what it allows and what it doesn't allow are really more concerned about the substantive changes, any dimensional changes that come in, any quote-unquote policy changes. And the formatting and usability is great, but it doesn't affect how people can build and what they can do in the town. And that's really the issue, it seems to me.
And
So I'd leave it at just
we've
one.
got those.
And can I ask just one question? In regarding this special town meeting in the winter, is that meeting going to be held specifically for this bylaw change, or are you going to be piggybacking on some other special town meeting that might be held?
I don't know what the special town meeting would include because the warrant hasn't been open yet, so that'll be to be determined. But I appreciate all of your other comments as well.
So I
No,
would simply
Adam.
ask, in closing, to say, I don't see any harm in putting this off until the regular town meeting, and I think the whole process would benefit from that, unless you can really get it right before the public hearing, before the ARB. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Yeah, if you don't mind. Hi, my name's Adam Chapdelaine. I'm the town manager. Chris, the current plan was to call a special town meeting for primarily for the purpose of the zoning recodification. Since we first started talking about that, there are a few other things that we'd likely put on the warrant, primarily budget-related, capital budget-related in regards to some of the school construction projects. But initially, the idea was to ask the Board of Selectmen to call a special town meeting for this process.
I think Patricia actually had her hand up. Sorry, sir. Paul. Patricia, then Paul. And I don't know if there were any other hands.
Thank you. I would like to echo Mr. Parise's request. As a town meeting member, I would find it almost impossible to vote for something like this without having red line version in front of me. Another thing, the gentleman asked what will happen after the special town meeting. That will depend on whether it passes or not. It is going to need a 2/3 majority at town meeting. Also, I was wondering why there is no definition of foundation as far as, unless I missed it, in definitions. Most of us have a foundation in our house, hopefully, and I think it's pretty foundational to have that foundation definition. Also, the gentleman behind me asked about what will happen after if this special town meeting, if the special town meeting passes the recodification document. My fear is that if we in fact pass policy changes which have been slipped through, as they tried to do with even the changes at the beginning of our zoning bylaw, they initially tried to water down the definition of purpose in a very drastic fashion. And if in fact they do manage to slip through policy changes, that takes away town meeting's right to discuss policy changes at an individual town meeting warrant article level, which is where this should occur. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul? And then, oh, actually, I'm sorry, before you start, Steve. Sorry, it's a lot of people answering and continuing.
Steve
Thank
Revelak.
you for understanding.
Steve Revelak, Zoning Recodification Working Group. With regards to the definition of foundation, in the current zoning bylaw, I don't see a definition of foundation. So I suspect it's been omitted from the recodification draft because it's not currently in the original or the current zoning bylaw.
Thank you, Steve. Paul?
Hi. Don Furia, I'm Precinct 15. Section 8, 8.1, non-conforming uses and structures. You know, I've read applicability. I'm just looking for a simple answer that defines if I have a non-conforming piece of property, which I do, it's 5,850 feet, built in 1958. I'd like to know exactly what it is, what's non-conforming about it, and have this section a little bit clearer, especially now since places are being built and changed. And I'd like to know if the property next to me, which is 6,000 square feet, what's being applied to them as far as what this definition is, you know, so.
Can you tell me which section you were looking at again?
Under the proposals, under 8.1, special regulations.
8.1.
That's where you deferred anything about non-conforming property to.
Okay, it's a comment, really. It's more of a comment.
What was that?
You're making a comment.
I'm making a comment, but I'd also like to
It's wrapped
know
into
if
a
that can be
question?
further clarified so that other people who are in the same position would like to get a clearer idea of what's non-conforming.
What
You
consists
try to
of
read this and you don't
non-conforming
know.
in 8.1 in this section? Would you mind coming to the mic, please?
Hi there. This section pretty much tracks the
This
statute.
is Judy Barrett, by
Hi,
the way.
sorry.
That's okay.
So there's nonconformity of dimensions and there's nonconformity of use, and they're treated differently. So I need to know more about the specific concern that you have.
So I think,
If you have a,
Judy, it might be helpful to describe what a conforming lot is before you get into what a non-conforming lot is.
that's a good idea. A conforming lot is one that meets the minimum area requirements, a lot area, lot size for a district, with a structure that meets all the setback requirements and height and so forth. If you're a single family or two-family dwelling, the owner of that property has a little more, I guess I'd call flexibility under the statute to make changes than a non-residential structure. So each case is taken to the Board of Appeals for a finding, whether the proposed change in the structure would make conditions worse on the lot for abutting properties and so forth. So they are taken on a case-by-case basis. But a conforming lot it meets the area requirements, the building on it meets the setback requirements. You can also have a situation where a use exists that isn't allowed by zoning today, so changing a non-conforming use would also require a finding by the Board of Appeals. Is that helpful? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Judy. Liz, and then Brian.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Pyle. I'm on town meeting, and I'm also a member of the residential study group. I'd like to reiterate some of the concerns that have been expressed about the timeline and how quickly this is going to go before town meeting. When I came tonight, I thought that the comments that had been made already would be incorporated into a draft that we could all look at and review. However, I see that the second reading draft is still in the same place that it was in July. What I would like to request is that once the comments are made, that they're put into a third reading draft, and then at that point, there is another opportunity for review and comment on the third reading draft before it goes to the ARB, with another round where people can submit, because I don't know if the comments that I've made were incorporated, or if they were incorporated all or in part, or if the meaning has been changed at all. And I'd just like to request more opportunity for public comment, even at the risk of delaying the town meeting vote on this to the spring or to next fall, because I think it's more important to have a thorough review and to get it right than to rush it through for a winter vote. So thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Just will say one thing, which I appreciate the suggestion of the timeline and the possibility of having another iteration. That's something for us to discuss with the consultant. And then the second thing I want to say is, just like with the first reading draft, we actually compiled a matrix of all of the comments and how they were addressed. We will have another document like that to provide. So you will actually be able to track, if you provided a comment, that is, where or what happened to that comment in the next draft, in the next iteration. So, okay. And then Brian.
Hi, Brian Merrig, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 8. And can I just take a second first and thank the working group for their efforts on this, which is a huge task, and better you than me. The comment I'd like to make is actually one I've already made in writing, but some things have transpired since then that I'd like to add to. And my issues are around the sections that have to do with flooding and wetlands.
Yes.
One of which is proposed for, several of which were proposed for elimination, one of which is still, two of which are still proposed for elimination. And the one that's proposed for elimination has to do with what are called in the zoning bylaw and what is called an inland wetlands district. The Conservation Commission, it's said in the report that the Conservation Commission has proposed eliminating that provision. That's not quite true, with all due respect. What the Conservation Commission was asked was to opine on this, and what they did was vote that they didn't object if the zoning bylaw recodification committee wanted to review it, remove it. Speaking with the members individually, they said that because they have nothing to do with zoning, and they have not reviewed the zoning bylaw. And so they answered the question that was asked in the way that it was posed to them. I think the question that needs to be answered is the one that RKG asks in its report, which is, what is the relationship between the regulations of the Inland Wetland District and the Conservation Commission's wetland regulations? And I don't believe that anyone has actually made an effort to answer that question. The regulations, as a layman read them at least, are not, the regulations in the zoning bylaw are not completely a subset of those of the wetlands, the local wetlands bylaw. There are some things in the Inland Wetlands District in the zoning bylaw that don't exist in the wetlands bylaw. And so I think deciding to take them out is a substantive change that without a basis at this point, because no one has really done that analysis. So I would ask again that those sections be retained until that analysis can be done in a substantive rewriting of the zoning bylaw.
Okay, I want to just check to see if Kathy, on behalf of the commission, would like to talk about this. Could you go to the mic, Kathy, please? Let me raise this.
Just some corrections. It was I, as an environmental planner and knowing wetlands regulations, but not land use and zoning as well, made the recommendation to the Conservation Commission that we take out these two sections, because I read a lot of duplication into them. We had a discussion, we voted, and the correction is the Conservation Commission voted that if the Zoning Recodification Committee wants to take the section out, we had no problem. But then discussing with Brian, I understand that there may be some very subtle language that do not relate to the regulations, like 50-foot setback or where the wetland line is, but maybe something like dumping or something like drilling requirements that are stronger for reviewing projects that are in the zoning bylaw, which are not in the wetlands regulations, and that it might, he's made the recommendation that we put this off and have some more money put to evaluating the two sections, and maybe, I'm suggesting maybe calling them something different so that it's not confusing that inland wetland sounds like Conservation Commission, but that we're regulating something that's important for development regulation or land use regulation, but we're not duplicating the efforts of the Conservation Commission. The way it's written now, it looks there's more duplication than there is dissimilarity, but you need to ferret out what those dissimilarities are or what those differences are and put them in the zoning regulations. I do not have the background to do that. It would take a consultant, I think, to do that kind of work.
Okay.
Nor do the members of the Conservation Commission. Same thing as Judy brought up to me with the floodplain regulations for environmental purposes are more stringent under the wetlands, our bylaws, but we don't have the ability to regulate land use. We only regulate environmental impacts of development, and so there may be, for flood insurance purposes and other reasons, that sections of that part of the bylaw needs to remain. So I guess I'm going to discuss it on Thursday night with the Conservation Commission, and we may come back to have this being put aside for further review.
Okay.
So I hope that explains how we got to this point.
Is that anything further? Anything else to add from anybody else? No. Oh, okay, Winnell, sorry.
Okay, Nell Evans, Orchard Place. I'm also a member of the residential study group. I understand the response about the red line version and why that is not possible, but I think most of the comments here tonight relate to format issues. I do want to thank the Zoning Recodification Working Group. This is meticulous, nitpicking work. And I know this for a fact because I sat down and read the existing bylaws and the second reading draft. It took me well over a day. And I think what we really have to consider is who the audience is for this, and it is the town meeting members. Mm-hmm. And I just have a really hard time believing that many people are going to make the effort to do this. I sent a document today to the Zoning Recodification Group detailing the errors that I found in my reading, and I bring those up not in any way to criticize your efforts, but once again to emphasize how meticulous this work is. And there are small errors of transcription and numbers moved, but the only way that we are going to find those and prevent them from being in the version that is hopefully eventually passed is by having many eyes on them and by also being able to compare each version that comes along to the current existing bylaws. And without the ability to do that, I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble. I do not want to do again what I did comparing these two documents. It was not fun. And again, I just don't think anybody else is going to do that. So maybe if not a red line version, could we do a side-by-side version of each section? There's got to be some way to make it easier for people instead of this continual accumulation of supporting documents, which are helpful but also more confusing in a lot of ways. So I hope that something can be developed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Julie had I want to get a new question, and then we'll come back.
Julie Brazil, town meeting member. Can you explain with an example or two where conflicts with state law could creep in? How does that work? How can that be okay? How are we allowed to be behind, and how are those conflicts resolved if we don't do a recodification? I just don't understand that sentence.
So I would ask actually if Judy, if you can talk about the conflicts that you found with state law and how those were addressed.
Well, actually, you provided one of the best examples in your slide presentation, but in your zoning right now, you talk about special permits for religious uses or educational uses or child care centers, and those are specifically exempt under the State Zoning Act. So you have what we would call a facial inconsistency in your zoning. Now, a couple of things that people should just understand. Sometimes facial inconsistencies exist because at the time that you adopted your zoning, something was fine. 10 years later, the statute was changed, but your zoning wasn't updated. And so over time, you end up with these kind of disconnects. And those are the kinds of things that can sort of get you in a little trouble. I don't think you want an applicant for a religious use or a school, coming and saying, I'll do a site plan, but I'm not going to come and apply for a special permit and end up with a debate over it. Not that that would happen, but right now your zoning says that's what they have to do. So that's the kind of thing that just needs to be cleaned up. There are other things that are actually much more recent. The horizon for a special permit has historically been 2 years that someone had to make meaningful use of that permit. Well, as of last year, that's now 3 years. Building permits have gone from 6 months to 12 months. And unfortunately, these things aren't always explained well to communities. You don't know because they're tucked into a budget bill or something. And so it's just that kind of cleanup that you want to do when you're doing a recodification. Okay.
Can we use the mic, please?
Thank you. You mentioned about the zoning bylaw has presently says schools or churches or something need a special permit. The use is covered by the Dover Amendment, but the town can regulate dimensional, use a special permit process to deal with the dimensional aspects.
Right,
you couldn't put up a 10-story church in a R1 zone, for example, because our dimensional requirements would be different.
Let's clarify this further. I just heard this comment earlier, so that's why I'm nodding my head.
Chapter 40A, Section 3 specifically says no special permit shall be required for those uses. You are correct.
Use the mic, please.
The use is a religious use. You cannot require someone to apply for a special permit for a steeple. You can't do that. What you can do, and what many communities do, is require site plan review for a religious use or a school. And through site plan review, you work with the applicant on dimensional setbacks and so forth. But you cannot use a special permit to regulate dimensions on one of those uses. It's just, I'm not going to stand here and tell you you can. Sorry. I just can't.
Okay. Thank you, Judy. Is the mic? I don't know if the mic is on. Did the mic die? No, you should use the mic.
What I started to say is I think this has been an issue in town because at times there have been schools, even the Thompson School, that exceeds the dimensional requirements of the bylaw without a special permit and did not go through the variance process. So I'd ask you, if you do change that wording, to be careful to acknowledge what is required under 40A in those situations. But the real reason I wanted to talk again is I had a couple of questions about the RKG memo. The date in the heading is February 28th. I understand the red text is newer. Does anyone know what the date is for the red text?
really hope there's not only one by the end of the evening. That's going to be it, right? All right, October 11th is the date.
October 11th, okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
that's the date that we issued this, so
Great. And then
those
the
are the
other question
red
is,
comments on the RKG memo, that's the question.
at a number of places it says things like deferred to future zoning amendment phase. Does that mean before the hearing on the changes, in this version, or does it mean after? And I'm thinking in particular with signs.
It potentially means a policy change in the future. That's what that means. So deferred to a future time, a future phase of zoning amendments that is not happening during the recodification process, which is the process we're in right now.
Okay, so whenever we see that language in here, that's not going to be a change that takes place.
Because it's just a
in the next
response
version.
to the memo.
All right, got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We lost a mic and now there's no more questions. There's a question.
I have a brief question as a follow-up to my initial question, Paul Parisi. When we finish this phase one, which is a recodification, reformatting, all the goals that you said to meet state requirements and so forth, then there'll be a phase two in 2018, where you're going to go into policy changes and substantive changes. I would like to recommend that you take the phase one document and make a red line copy of that with all substantive changes so we don't have to go through this again.
Most certainly.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Any other questions? There's another question.
Is there a date for the next draft?
Well, thank you.
Jenny, is there a date for the next draft to be released?
What is the...
November 10th, I think you asked for me, but I don't know when you're planning to publish it.
Right. Well, the group will look at it, the Recodification Working Group will see a draft 10.
There will be a draft on November 10th. The Zoning Recodification Working Group is having a meeting where they will review the draft, similar to the way that they've reviewed all of the drafts. And we will figure out where we are in this process and what the next step will be. Right now, the proposed next step, as I mentioned before, is the hearing draft is what we would have in hand, and we would take that forward to a public hearing process. But we do appreciate all the feedback we've heard this evening related to that. Any other questions? Comments, celebration, balloons? I wish these lights were on still. Sorry they're not on tonight. All right, so I'm gonna go, I have to go over here now. Don't have balloons, and that's it. The comments that you might still have, we are happy to have them through November 9th, ideally. If anything changes with the timeline, we of course will make the public aware of any changes. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you everybody for your incredibly thoughtful questions and comments and feedback. And thanks to Laura for her scribing. Do you want to say something about when the open houses are? The open houses are November.
Tomorrow. There's one tomorrow from 5 to 7 in the first floor conference room, and November 2nd and November 9th. They're all Thursdays from 5 to 7.
Okay. Thanks everybody. Have a great night.